Welcome again. Let me ask you, is Governor DeSantis unbeatable in 2022? So today, we're going to be discussing this. My name is Robert Asensio, and no fake news here. I have beside me famed attorney, former state representative, Republican state representative, J.C. Planas, who's also an ethics and elections law attorney. I want to talk about that. And let's talk about something real quick before we go into the meat of the conversation.
Okay.
Professor now, right?
Yes, and actually now it's official. I'm on the system, adjunct professor at St. Thomas
Bump.
University undergrad. I taught at their law school for a while. I taught election law and state and local government law, and now I'm actually teaching undergrads Introduction to American Government.
Oh man, when does that start?
That it started last week. I took over for a professor that had to resign. And then next month I start an online course on law and politics and how law and politics intertwine.
That's going to be badass. So tell the audience just a little bit about the syllabus and what you're teaching.
Well, actually, I'm still developing the syllabus for law and politics. One of the things I found as a practicing attorney is that a lot of attorneys don't have a good grasp of politics. And
Really?
Well, it's very interesting. And when I taught law school, I taught the political courses. So I would always get the students that were interested in politics. Now in undergrad, I'm going to be teaching, a lot of these political science majors want to be attorneys. So I'm going to teach them, number one, how I intersected law and politics in my career and how they can do that. But the introduction to American government, which is sort of like an introduction to political science, that's the fascinating, because we're going to get into campaigning. Right now we're studying media and politics, and they all came to the class with a perception of how the media shapes politics. And I was giving them the perception of the opposite. Sometimes how politics shapes the media and how, politicians plant stories and use the media in many more ways sometimes than even the media uses politicians.
Well, let's talk about that and we'll talk about that towards the end of the show, because I want to talk about misinformation, disinformation when it comes to shaping the political landscape. Certainly in Florida, we know we have an election in 2022. We have a governor who was he got his JD from Harvard University, right?
Mm-hmm.
Attorney. He was a congressman in CD, Congressional District 3. He was a JAG officer in the military, in the Navy. He served in Guantanamo, representing the soldiers or the cases against the soldiers and the people who they brought to Guantanamo from the Persian Gulf, I believe. But the House and the state Senate, actually politics is full of attorneys. Do you see any rising stars in your class already?
Well, no, for undergrads, not really. When I taught law school, actually, I was very blessed to have some phenomenal students. One that went on to clerk for several judges at the 3rd District Court of Appeal. But one of my students actually is now a member of the Miami Lakes City Commission, Josh Dieguez, who has become a phenomenal friend. And I'm sure he's probably been on this forum, not with you, but with other of the hosts here. He's now a commissioner in Miami Lakes and probably one of the best students I ever had. I taught him in both election law and state and local government.
Republican or Democrat?
He's a moderate Republican.
Okay.
And, one of the sad things I had is one of my former students was one of the folks who died in Surfside.
Oh, my condolences.
A lot of me and my former students reconnected at that point. Edgar Gonzalez was brilliant. He was actually a Trumpian Republican, and we used to debate during that election all the time. And at his funeral, I told his parents and I told his daughters and wife what a brilliant attorney their dad was. And I'm like, I used to love arguing with him because it was just a wonderful debate. And the girls were like, wait a minute, we used to hate arguing with him. I'm like, it was a little different of a position, because when you're a law professor, that's what you want. You want that debate. And my students in undergrad, I've told them, I will try my hardest not to put in my views, but I want them to have views. They can be left, they can be right, they can be center, but the only thing that I do not allow is for them to have no opinions. They must form an opinion. They must be able to defend it. They must be able to argue their points And that's what I want to teach them.
So that sounds like a show for the future, right?
Yes.
We should maybe talk about, preparing tomorrow's attorneys, right?
Yes.
Well,
tomorrow's leaders.
which are leaders today,
Yeah.
right? Because many of these people are already serving in different positions throughout the community. But let's go back to the on topic of the governor. Let's talk about his first term in office. He's nearing the end of his first term of the election as the governor. He's seeking his second term. How have you seen his first 4 years in office?
I don't think they have been cohesive at all. It's almost as if we have had, 3 different Ron DeSantis during the time. And it's interesting because he wins a primary against a member of the Florida cabinet, Adam Putnam, when no one thought he had a chance, because Donald Trump comes in and endorses him, and he does these very pro-Trump ads. He wins with less than 50% of the vote. And it seems like that little margin of victory, he had a recount in that election. And it seems like that affected his first year, his first session. He came in very bipartisan. He came in with a very almost progressive environmental agenda, especially.
So true. I remember speaking to Michael Putney about that.
Especially for a Republican. I mean, just his wanting to save the Everglades, his criticism of agriculture, that was big. And he got everything he wanted in that first session, but he had limited goals. In his second session, running up to the 2020 election, he moves a little bit more to the right in a way that some people thought, okay, maybe it's just for the election. But then after the 2020 election, it seems like we got a different Ron DeSantis. If you look at what, you could have said that in that first session, he realized he won with less than 50%. So he had to build a broad coalition. And after 2020, he decided he was going to go 100% on the base. And we saw him back what started off as an atrocious, draconian, anti-democratic election bill. Luckily, it got watered down significantly through the legislative session, but it is still now something that is being litigated in federal court because it is extremely restrictive of elderly minorities who have received a vote by mail ballot for years and now all of a sudden have to reapply every election. They have to present identification. And in many cases, older people do not drive anymore, so they've lost their driver's license. If you're 90, you've had a social security number for 60,
where is that card?
60 years, exactly.
Do you know where your card is?
It's in my wallet. It's actually in my wallet.
I was looking for one this morning.
I saw, the worst thing on the Social Security card is it says do not laminate. I'm like, well, if you laminated it, it'd be easier to keep. But so these folks may not have and if you're an elderly minority living alone in a house, how do you get all this information to get your vote by mail ballot?
So let me ask you this. Was that strategy where he comes in because he wins by less than 1 percentage point, right?
Yeah.
Less than half a percentage point.
Yeah.
It
was less than half because it went to a machine recount.
Yes. And it's roughly 32,300 votes thereabouts. In the state of Florida, where you have 21 million, almost 22 million people.
He lost his home county. He lost Duval.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
But then coming back to it, was that strategy that he comes in with a more inclusive agenda, and then as you see him ramping up over the years, now it is without doubt it is an exclusionary agenda. As a matter of fact, today the Supreme Court, I believe the Supreme Court of Florida, rejected the governor's yesterday request to redraw.
Well, what happened was he wanted to get rid of that district. And for the first time ever, a governor has submitted a congressional plan. Governors usually sign off. So during redistricting, the House and Senate have always had an agreement where the House passes the House plan, the Senate passes the House plan, and each chamber respects the will of the other chamber on that. Because of separation of powers, the governor cannot veto the state House or state Senate redistricting plans. The governor can only veto the congressional plans to which the other two houses must come in agreement. However, no governor has ever tried to submit their own plan. And what happened here was he tried to do that. He wanted to out Texas, I guess. And when he got pushback, he said, no, let me go to the Supreme Court. I think you have to read between the lines of what the Supreme Court did yesterday, because they told him, listen, we can't rule on this because there's no record. There's no factual evidence here that's been put in. And if you look at redistricting lawsuits from 10 years ago, there was a lot of testimony, a lot of facts that the court had to weigh in. And in this case, he's trying to look at a legality of something when the standard is really going to be, have you purposely done something to water down minority votes? And the Supreme Court basically told him, whatever plan they pass is going to face scrutiny, and there is going to be testimony as to whether or not this is being done purposely to water down minority votes. So they almost warned him.
So GC, you just mentioned something. So we're looking at assessing the governor's first term. And you pointed out that when he first got elected,
it's inconsistent.
Yeah, exactly. He's a different person than what we have today. More liberal, more all-inclusive today. He's more restrictive. Let's look at his agenda, right? The issues that he's put forward last year, last election cycle. I'm sorry, last legislative session. We had the anti-protest bill.
Yes,
that was very, very. That almost placed property over life.
Well, I think that the big part of it, and the reason that the courts have enjoined its enforcement, is it didn't define protest. It wanted to basically put in a specific officer's mind at a specific time what is a protest that they can shut down. And as we saw, during I supported everybody who was, out in the street banging pots and pans.
Legal protest.
Well, during when what happened in Cuba happened this summer, that folks in Cuba took to the streets. A lot of us in Miami went to, our usual places, La Cajeta, Versailles. Yeah, and we banged pots and pans, and that was legitimate. But then we saw 2 days later, folks blocking 836. Number one, not only is that not legitimate protest, but that's dangerous, extremely dangerous for many, many people, yet the cops didn't arrest anyone. And that's the fear. Are the cops going to make a decision and are some people going to get arrested because of the color of the skin or not? Blocking 836 in many ways is much worse than what happened with Black Lives Matter.
Let's break that down for the audience, right? Because we all want a decisive leader, right? We all want a person that's going to be, decisive and take action. But when that bill was passed, the anti-protest bill that I call, it prohibited mass gatherings, people blocking the roadways. And then that was based on the heels of Black Lives Matter protests, right? The national protest.
Which, by the way, 90% of all Black Lives Matter protests, even here in Florida, were all peaceful. You had some incidents of violence, but you did not have, this wave of violence and terror like Republicans are trying to sell to people on that. Like they tried to sell it during the 2020 election. The majority of the protests were peaceful. Now, you could also make an argument to say, listen, while it is wrong, it is understandable the frustration in the African-American community, because if you are, it's just a fact of life. If you are an African-American male and you have an encounter with the police, you have a much greater chance of having that turn violent than if it's a white person. And that's something should not be acceptable in today's America.
So we saw that bill pass because it was passed by party line. And it was rushed. It was a priority bill, I believe.
And it was done in fear. And that's what you see the Republicans campaign on now. They are trying to stroke fear in their voters in order to.
Is there a basis for that fear?
No, there's no basis for that fear. Listen, you come on these shows and you try to be as open and as bipartisan as possible. But the truth is that when Donald Trump descends down his staircase and says, make America great again, at the same time that he's talking about building a wall, it's very obvious that make America great again is make America white again.
Well, let's return back to the nationalism. right?
It is.
Okay.
They, you know, there are, and George Will said this. He goes, part of the problem is you have the Trumpites on one side and the Bernieites on the other side, and both of them want to return to the 50s. The Trumpites want to go culturally to the 50s, where almost everybody's white, nobody's gay. You know, you didn't lose your job to
At least not
foreigners.
openly.
You know, and then the Bernieites, you wanted to go back to a time where everybody worked for the same company for the whole life. They got a pension there. They didn't have to compete against foreign workers. And these are unrealistic things on both sides.
Let's talk about going back to the governor's first 4 years, right? So let's talk about the economy, because we talked about, you know, some of the agenda items and we see what they are. We'll talk about some of the governor's priorities this session. We're in the fourth week, ending the fourth week of the 60-day cycle.
I mean, just today in the House of Representatives, they're voting on a 15-week abortion ban. You know, Virginia just yesterday defeated a 20-week abortion ban. A 15-week abortion ban. I mean, I hate abortion. I don't like the practice. But in the year 2022, it is within our grasp to eliminate unwanted pregnancy, and then there would be no abortion.
Yeah. So does that exclude, or does that prevent the right to have an abortion if a woman that gets raped?
No. In fact, there was an amendment in the Senate by Senator Lauren Book to exclude rape and incest on those, and it was defeated.
Denied,
and
right?
It was defeated. I mean, this is just, at the end of the day, this is misogyny and cruelty. And again, it's not, everybody wants to categorize Democrats as being pro-abortion. No Democrat is pro-abortion. We just don't believe that the government should be making these laws and forcing people. The truth is that the one president of the United States that reduced the abortion amount more than any other president was Barack Obama, because the Affordable Care Act provided reproductive health care. More women had access to health care and contraception than ever before, and abortion numbers went down under President Obama.
But let's go back to the state. So under the governor, do you see health preventive care for an education for those that are in high risk pregnancy, those more prevalent?
He could have expanded Medicaid and it would have done that. And it's federal dollars. And he's refused to expand Medicaid. There were, you know, the Florida Senate, which has always been the more moderate of the two chambers. And when you were in the House, you saw where the Senate tried to, your speaker, I think, was Corcoran, right? Yeah. So remember, the Senate passed Medicaid expansion and the House dug in its heels because this Republican mentality of, you know, this false cry of socialism. Expanded Medicaid is not socialism. We can have a capitalist system where we can still guarantee minimal health care for all. And I'll give you an example. I, you know, as a former legislator like you, I have the ability to buy into the state healthcare plan, which I do. I pay my premium every month. And I had to have
which is rather expensive, I must say.
But for what we get, it's not.
The benefits are good.
Yes, and we have a benefit that others don't get. So I lost a little bit of weight. So like something here started sticking out. And my doctor said, you should get a CT scan. So under the great plan that I have, my copay for the CT scan was still $600. I'm very blessed that I have the wherewithal to do that. But what about someone with less insurance that would have more of a copay that doesn't have that money? What if something
which is the case with most Americans, right?
Most Americans.
So let's talk about the economy, the state economy. We had over last session, it was, I believe the budget was just at $100 billion, right? Depending on who you ask, and this is pretty much, you'll get an answer based on party line ideology. Is the economy doing great? Those that are more conservative will say, and those that are leaning with the governor will say the Florida economy is doing booming. However, if you look at the United Way's Alice report, the 2020 addendum, you'll see that roughly 60% of the households in Dade County, 50% thereabouts in the state of Florida, but let's stay with Dade County, roughly 60% of the households are one paycheck away from economic disaster, where most families cannot afford a $200 to $400 unexpected hit.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about.
And again, when they say the economy is doing great, for some people it is doing wonderful, but the dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots keeps growing, and Republicans don't want to be able to fix that. Marco Rubio the other day, oh, we're going to be the party of the working class. I'm like, okay, where are you on increased wages? Where are you on access to healthcare? Where are you on child tax credit? Where are you on help for working mothers? And they're not.
So do you see anything positive from this governor over the last 4 years that he has done with regard to his governorship for the state of Florida?
I mean, you have to give him props for what he's done to try to save the Everglades. I think it's extremely important. I think it's not just the Everglades, but when you look at the algae bloom in a lot of the bays, we have to find a way to fix that. We are always playing catch up with a lot of our mistakes. I say in Miami-Dade County, we're still paying for the errors of the commissioners from the 1950s. In Florida, we are still paying for that plan to drain the swamps and to build the canals, because we interrupted the free flow of water. And the ecosystem can heal itself if you leave it alone, but when you change the flow of water, you're going to have problems. The creation, nature, God's creation of the Everglades was to filter water, but when you interrupt that, it's not able to filter the water, and we create these algae blooms.
So in 2014, I believe, the legislature voted to reduce the level of the threshold of the accepted threshold for contaminants going into the water. And I think right after that, we began to see this increase of algae blooms across the state. So yes, I will agree with you that that's a good move. But is the governor, I repeat, is the governor beatable in 2022?
Listen, I think anybody is beatable. And in today's climate where things can turn on a dime, things change from one week to the next. The issue here is, can Democrats rally enough to do it? And I think the importance is, how do you rally your base? One of the reasons that Biden lost Florida is that Republicans did a better job of turnout than Democrats did. If you look at a lot of areas, small counties, small rural counties, Democrats don't need to win those. But, Trump was winning by 60%. If Democrats in small counties would have reduced that margin by just 3 or 4 percentage points, then Biden would have won Florida. I think the secret is, how do you motivate your voters to come out and do that?
Well, let's talk about the new candidate. There's 6 file candidates to run against the governor.
3 top tier.
3 top tier, exactly. Let's talk about the 3 top tier candidates. We have Charlie Crist, Nikki Fried, and Annette Taddeo. Senator Taddeo, the Commissioner
and I have
Agriculture.
endorsed Senator Taddeo.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. And then we have former Governor Charlie Crist, who was also the Attorney General, who was also the Commissioner of Education. I mean, the guy's done a lot. So let's talk about the 3 candidates, and which one is, how do you see their races coming along?
So
for the benefit of the audience.
I think one of the issues is that Charlie Crist has been on the ballot so many times at so many levels that the name recognition obviously helps him. I think that, Charlie is a good guy, and I was an ally of his when he was governor. But Charlie could have done more to push back on Rubio, to push back on some of the forces, and didn't. When Charlie ran against Rick Scott trying to make his comeback, there were a lot of errors that he made, a lot of them just not pushing hard enough on certain things. And, I think it cost him. He lost to Rick Scott by very, very little. And I think that, Charlie has to prove that he has the grit to be able to get in. Nikki Fried is very interesting because she got a lot of Republican votes when she won for, her job as agriculture commissioner. She appealed across the board. I think her issue is that she's had gaffes that of her own making. And I think that's her biggest problem. I think she tries to push herself out there to the point that sometimes it doesn't come across. Annette has, right now is a regional candidate, but when people start listening to her, I think she has cross appeal that others do not have. I think she brings in the Hispanic, electorate in a way that I think we need to be represented. But Annette has always been someone who's been able to work across the aisle. Charlie was that as a Republican in the state Senate, 30 years ago, but Nikki Fried has never really had much relationship with the legislature, has never really worked the legislative agenda. Annette has that history. I think Annette can appeal to other, voters, especially to moderate, non-party registered women voters. And I think that's a big part of her appeal. She just needs to get her name out. I do think when you look at the big scandal that we're facing right now with these false voter registrations, these are registered Democrats that Republican operatives went into their, into public housing. Can you tell the
audience a little bit about that?
So what happened was we had all these folks that lived in residential towers, that lived in public housing, and they had been registered Democrats for years and years and years. And about 8-9 months ago, folks with red hats, with RPOF, Republican Party of Florida shirts, went into these residential towers, told these folks, hey, we're here to re-register you to vote. And all of a sudden there were switches from from Democrat to Republican. In one case, one of these switches was actually the person tried to re-register as a Democrat. Whoever was doing the form actually crossed out Democrat, put in Republican, and initialed it in a handwriting that was clearly 100% different than the handwriting that had filled it out. I mean, Annette has actually brought this investigation to light because a lot of these folks actually contacted her first. And she was the one who brought this information to light because.
Has that been localized to South Florida, or is it statewide?
Oh, this is made national news.
No, but the scam, let's call it that. It's a scam.
I think
is it
right now,
South Florida, or are there any signs of it expanding beyond the state county?
Because of how it was done, and because at the same time Republicans were beating the drumbeat that they were going to jump over Democrats in registration, you can assume that it may have been done in other parts. I think the reason that it was found first here is because the saturation in these public housing units is so much that we were able to see it right away. I do think that when the investigation expands, you may find it in other parts of the state. And I am sure that as the national news started covering this, you are going to see folks who may notice it. The big detriment here is we're a closed party state. So any folks that were switched from Democrat to Republican are going to show up. If they haven't noticed yet, they're definitely going to notice in August when they try to vote in the primary and they're denied the ability to vote.
So how are we doing? 2 minutes? Okay. Can we go to 5? Just so I can ask a couple more questions. Who do you think has the best shot of beating Governor DeSantis?
DeSantis. I think that,
why is that?
I think DeSantis is what can beat DeSantis. He had a series of defeats yesterday between the Supreme Court, between the state Senate pushing back on an agriculture bill. I think that if DeSantis can be shown to have bitten off, I mean, we haven't even talked about the Don't Say Gay bill,
yes,
the abortion ban. There's a series of things that if the public realizes, DeSantis wants to say this is the freest state in the country, but he's trying to restrict, women's reproductive rights. He's trying to basically keep kids in the closet. There's a series of things that I think
businesses. I think it's fair to say that he
went after private business.
Yeah, he went after private. Well, it's weird because it almost seems like, I hate to put it this way, but it's like hypocrisy because on one side, he is calling for freedoms and liberties, and we will not mask, and we will not lock down, and we will not be told.
But if you're a business who wants to protect your workers, you're being restricted.
And then you fast forward to now during the Omicron. Thank God we're almost at the end of it. But during these spikes, these businesses that have been open, they had to shut down because their employees were sick, and the economy is actually hurting because of that.
Yeah. I mean, if everyone would have gotten vaccinated, if everyone would have continued wearing masks, we wouldn't have had the spikes that we had. And when all of a sudden you had spikes and people were sick, they had to shut down a business. You know, if you look at the folks that were vaccinated versus the ones that were not vaccinated, my wife got COVID. My wife is boosted. My wife had 1 day of symptoms and then was able within 4 days to go back to work. Folks that were unvaccinated basically were out for almost 2 weeks sometimes. In some cases, yeah, you had the folks that had no symptoms.
How do you think he managed, in your opinion, real quick? How do you think what would be your assessment of his management, the governor's management of the COVID crisis during the 2020 leading up to today?
He didn't manage it. He was in denial. And I think that that's part of
leave it to the local governments to handle.
He didn't. He prevented the local governments from handling it. That's part of the problem.
That's part of the controversy, or actually,
if you look at the best Republican governor during, actually probably the best governor during the crisis has been Massachusetts and Baker, because it's been balanced. It's been, you know, maybe Hogan also, you know, and these were moderate Republican governors. You know, that's the Republican I used to be, but
same here. I used to be a Republican, and I was very much for the people, but business growth
that is gone.
Hard to believe. So one last thing I wanted to ask you about misinformation, the impact of misinformation, disinformation in the media, and the play of the politics, because we know that as former politicians or people that are running for office, you know, there's a level of spin. Yeah. But what impact is that having on the landscape and the voters?
Misinformation in the media is important, but I think the worst form of misinformation actually happened through social media and chat groups. And you had folks who were bragging about getting their information from Facebook friends. Well, there was no source for that. I think what we are also just seeing at the tip of the iceberg was misinformation that was spreading through WhatsApp groups, and folks, you know, things being done to a lot of the, you know, Venezuelan American community, Colombian American community, a lot of these Latin American diaspora here, people that probably were going to vote Democrat, and then they were scared to the point that they either didn't vote or voted for Trump because of misinformation that was done in a lot of these WhatsApp apps groups, you know, tied to a lot of this diaspora.
Well, there's so much to talk about. We're running out of time, but you know, for the audience benefit, we have extended an invite to Governor DeSantis to be on the show. We want him to, you know, share with us why he should be reelected, talk to us about his accomplishments and his failures in his first term. We've also requested Senator Tadeo, candidate for governor, to come on today. She was wanting to come on, but she was in the car. And you know, we're in modern day. Technology is Zooming by phones is not always the best place to be when you want to do an interview.
You can Zoom by phone if you're a passenger, but if you're driving, please don't Zoom by phone if you're driving.
So we want to have them. But JC, maybe we could talk a little bit in the next segment about the strategies that we're going to see in the next cycle, right? Now leading up to the elections, we know that there's going to be a lot of decent play, and then there's going to be a lot of dirty play.
Yeah.
And we saw Glenna Milberg's congratulations to Glenna and the Channel 10 team for the Emmy that you won on the expose of the shill candidates. But we see political dirtiness going on. Would you be willing to come back to talk to us about that?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, great. So on that note, this has been Robert Asensio with JC Planas on Community Newspapers. To the Millers, thank you. Andres, always the production behind the scene, thank you. We can't thank you enough. Drop us a line. Let us know what you think. Please give us some ideas for the next show.
Yes.
See you next time, JC.
Thank you very much. Thank you.